Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about the fantasy playoff strength of schedule for the rest of the 2022 season. Of course, mainly focusing on weeks 15 through 17 and talking about matchups at all primary positions, whether that be running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and even defenses. So, of course, besides talking about matchups and giving you guys a representation as to how valuable that variable is in terms of determining successes or failures in a given player's potential future, because again, we've talked about it every single week. 11 other players trying to specifically stop your fantasy prospects from scoring is a huge variable when we predict potential successes of the future. So we'll go ahead and focus on that given variable, giving you guys all the information that I've possibly collected over the course of the last couple of days in terms of setting up this video in order to set yourselves up for success for the fantasy football playoffs to bring home that fantasy football championship in the 2022 season. Before we begin, of course, if you guys have not yet already, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season. So do yourself a favor and subscribe down below. It takes 2 seconds out of your day, and we're bringing you guys daily fantasy football content besides potential rankings, strength of schedule videos, live streams, whether that's Sunday mornings or even Thursday nights. After tonight's Thursday night football game between the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots, I will be live streaming here on the channel. So for those of you who are interested, come on by, ask a question, whether it's a starter sit for week 13, whether it's a potential trade question for the remainder of the season, or waiver wire pickups for the fantasy football playoffs for those of you who have already gone ahead and clinched and are trying to prepare for the future. Thank you very much. Speaking of the Thursday night football game, before we get into today's content, I want to remind you guys, for those of you who want to continue to play daily fantasy at your fingertips and perhaps don't have anybody playing in tonight's game, be sure to check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description, and when you travel to their website, you can go ahead and pick more or less on a given player statistic and have more daily fantasy at your fingertips. Tonight, between the Buffalo Bills and New England Patriots, my 3 picks are, of course, Sam Martin, less than 3 punts in the last 2 games that the New England Patriots have taken on the Bills. The Bills have not punted once. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to assume Josh Allen's going to continue to fire that up. Speaking of Josh Allen, I have him going more on 44.5 rushing yards. He's been able to accomplish this in 4 out of the last 5 games that he's participated in. And he'll, of course, be torching Bill Belichick's defense, as they have been one of the worst defenses in the league over the last couple years in terms of stopping opposing mobile quarterbacks. And the final pick is Ramondre Stevenson, going more than 4.5 receptions. Over the course of the last 5 weeks, he has gotten 38 targets and 33 receptions. He's been able to surpass that number of 4.5 receptions 4 out of the last 5 games. We're firing him up with, of course, Damian Harris out in tonight's contest. Check that out and use promo code Andrew today, because when you go ahead and sign up, when using promo code Andrew, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So go ahead, whether you're following, whether you're fading, check that out today. And whether it's the NFL, the NBA, you can go ahead, play PrizePicks your way. Thank you very much. Check that out today. All right, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about the running back position from weeks 15 through 17, giving you guys a little bit more perspective on the matter. So I want to explain what we are going ahead and presenting on the right side of the screen. As you can see, we have ranks 1 through 32. The number 1 ranked team, the Tennessee Titans, have the easiest strength of schedule for weeks 15 through 17 at the running back position, based on fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs thus far this season on average from week 7 through 12. And the main reason I wanted to focus on that spectrum of time is because it's the latest half of the season. Weeks 1 through 6 is the first half of the season so far, and weeks 7 through 12 is what we've mainly seen from these defenses as of late, and what we could potentially expect to see for the remainder of the season. So when we isolate that spectrum of time, it gives us a better indication as to what we can potentially anticipate in terms of fantasy matchups. So they take on the Los Angeles Chargers, the Houston Texans, and Dallas Cowboys. And we know 2 of those 3 matchups, specifically the first 2 weeks, 15 and 16 for the Houston Texans, are incredibly advantageous. Now, as you can see, SOS average to the left of those specific schedule, we have a number of 20.42. That indicates how many fantasy points on average those 3 teams are allowing as a combined total to opposing running backs over the course of the last 6 weeks. So just giving you some perspective. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Las Vegas Raiders there, who have the most difficult strength of schedule over the course of the fantasy football playoffs, which obviously is not going to bode well for Josh Jacobs, considering many of us are relying upon his efforts to go ahead and elevate us into the conversation of being a fantasy champion in 2022. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's go ahead and begin at the top side of this conversation, beginning with Derrick Henry. I have been mentioning this since probably the preseason. I've been mentioning it since week 5, week 8, week 11. All of the updates that I do for strength of schedule has always revolved around Derrick Henry needing to be on your roster in order to capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. And the team that is in your league that has Derrick Henry is most likely going to be able to get to week 17. So Considering he takes on the Los Angeles Chargers, who have been one of the worst teams at stopping the run, and then the week after, in week 16, they play against the Houston Texans. Just to give you some perspective, in a half PPR scoring format, Derrick Henry has put up a minimum of 35 fantasy points in each of the last 4 games he's played against the Houston Texans, one of those games being earlier this season. He is going to dominate, and he's going to elevate any squad that he is on to the fantasy playoffs. So if I'm in your position, and we're talking about the conversation of who do I want more, Derrick Henry going into the fantasy playoffs, or on the very opposite end of the spectrum, Josh Jacobs, I would clearly rather have Derrick Henry. I know many of you may be emotionally attached to the potential of Josh Jacobs. He's gotten you to this position. He's allowed you to be, one of the top teams in the standings for your respective league. But you have to understand that I am approaching this with an analytical and statistical approach. I don't really have any emotions attached to any of these players. I am approaching this purely in a way of trying to gather as many advantages as we can statistically to give ourselves the best advantage in winning. Because at the end of the day, that's the entire purpose of playing fantasy football. We want to win, we want those bragging rights, and we want to win some prizes. So if in fact you have the opportunity to trade Josh Jacobs for Derrick Henry, that's what I'm doing, easily. Because the strength of schedule for Josh Jacobs doesn't look pretty. And we know that Derrick Henry is attached to a team that is trying to win their division, trying to get a bye week for the AFC, and they're going to continue to play for the remainder of the season at a high rate. So absolutely, you want Derrick Henry on roster. Now, when we're moving on and talking about other running backs, Isaiah Pacheco should be an absolute fantastic play going for the entirety of the fantasy playoffs, and you want to have him on roster if, in fact, you can go ahead and get him there. Now, because of the fact that Clyde Edwards-Helaire has gone to the injured reserve, and we've had a full indication over the course of the last 3 weeks that without a doubt in our minds, Isaiah Pacheco is going to be the number one, and Jerick McKinnon, of course, will get a couple sprinkles of receptions and certainly thrive there. But ultimately, Isaiah Pacheco is the guy. And for those of you who may be worried about Melvin Gordon, just imagine the Melvin Gordon signing is very similar to what we saw the Kansas City Chiefs did a couple years ago with Le'Veon Bell. They signed him. They brought him in. Many of us panicked at the time. But quite frankly, I think this is the identical scenario where they're going to continue to work their main workhorse back, which is Isaiah Pacheco, as long as he's healthy. And throughout this span of Houston, Seattle, and Denver, it's extremely advantageous matchups that we want to have on roster. Of course, the second best matchups in the given playoffs. Moving on. Let's talk about Jonathan Taylor, who currently is on a pretty good streak of games, and he has incredible matchups up ahead, taking on Minnesota, the Los Angeles Chargers, and the New York Giants. Of course, you want to have him on roster. The only question is, can you afford to go ahead and miss out on the Week 14 bye that he has? Again, many of us who are in a position who have Jonathan Taylor on roster are worried about Week 14 because we need a win to get in. And if, in fact, you're not able to go ahead and have him on roster, maybe you don't even make the playoffs. But for those of you who have already clinched the position, or if you go ahead and win by this week, you can go ahead and clinch said position. But at this current moment in time, that's the biggest determining factor. Because otherwise, the play that Jonathan Taylor has put forth in the last 3 weeks, incredible. 20-plus rushing attempts in each of those 3 weeks, has put up a rushing touchdown in each of those 3 games. And if anything, he should have even had a second touchdown this last week, a Monday night against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Nonetheless, again, keeping this in mind, Week 14 has a lot of bye weeks, guys. The Atlanta Falcons, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, Indianapolis Colts, New Orleans Saints, Washington Commanders, they're all on bye. So you may not be able to afford to have those kind of players on roster, but if you can have Jonathan Taylor from weeks 15 through 17, I'd implore you to absolutely get him on roster and get ready to go. Another player that I wanted to mention, Dalvin Cook. Incredible overall schedule upcoming here, and he's a part of a team that is vying for the number 1 spot in the NFC. If, in fact, the Philadelphia Eagles go on a slide in the upcoming weeks, which they probably won't based on their strength of schedule, but if, in fact, they do, we're going to see this Minnesota Vikings offense continue to try to pump out victories because they want home field advantage throughout that playoffs. And even if they're not able to get the number 1 seed in their given division, they want to make sure that they have home field advantage so they can go ahead and play in a dome, not have to deal with any weather, and make sure that Kirk Cousins is ready to go. So, of course, Dalvin Cook should be fired up in many capacities. Another player that I really like, Miles Sanders. Again, besides the fact that they're running him a lot this season already, he's scoring a boatload of touchdowns, 8 rushing touchdowns already this season, tied with Jalen Hurts, which is great. But amongst all running backs, he's in that top conversation. He has pretty good matchups going up against Chicago, which is a great one. Dallas, they found a lot of success against even earlier this season. And then in Week 17, the championship week, takes on the New Orleans Saints. The history between Miles Sanders and the New Orleans Saints is incredible. If you go ahead and look at the last 2 games that he's played against that defense, even when the New Orleans Saints defense was the best run-stopping defense in the league, 16 carries for 94 yards last season against them, which is over a 5-yard per carry average. In the year prior, 14 carries for 115 and 2 touchdowns. We've seen a lot of success from Miles Sanders, the Eagles offense, against this defense. They should be able to have themselves a pretty good week 17. So if you're looking for a back to, clinch it up for you in the final week, I think Miles Sanders could be that. Another player that I liked, Gus Edwards, in week 15 specifically, takes on Cleveland. Earlier this season, when he came back from his injury, from the ACL, he put up 18.6 fantasy points in his debut with 16 carries for 66 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns against Cleveland. I think he's an automatic play in that given matchup and can continue that potential momentum going into that Atlanta Falcons game, which is another fantastic matchup. If J.K. Dobbins isn't there to impede on his overall potential for success, Gus Edwards, another one of these players that, again, may not be valued as high as these, bigger name players, but has just as much potential fantasy value. Now, speaking of a player that doesn't have as big of a name and is a rookie right now, is Brian Robinson. He has a pretty good schedule taking on the New York Giants, San Francisco 49ers, and Cleveland Browns. Now, the San Francisco 49ers matchup is awful. We want to avoid it at all costs. But if you can go ahead and have him on roster for that New York Giants game, which we'll get a taste of this week in specific as to what we can expect in week 15, and then go ahead and get ourselves into a conversation where in week 17 against Cleveland, one of the best matchups in the given season, absolutely fantastic in my mind, especially from an offense that wants to run the ball first and foremost. We talk about Ramondre Stevenson as another great player. Again, you got to remember, when we talk about the strength of schedule at this given position, we are specifically isolating rushing statistics alone. We are not talking about the potential of fantasy points allowed from defenses based on receiving statistics. Receiving statistics have nothing to do with matchups at the running back position. The biggest priority as to what a running back can venture in terms of receiving statistics is often due to how many targets they're giving from their quarterbacks and how likely their offense is going to incorporate them in the receiving game rather than specific matchups. So when we talk about Ramondre Stevenson, yes, he has a middle of the pack conversation, overall matchup, but it's fantastic considering in the last 5 games, 38 targets, 33 receptions, and that's why I went ahead and suggested him via PrizePicks for tonight's Thursday night football game. I'm expecting him to get over 4.5 receptions for the remainder of the season within this offense on a consistent basis. And in a half full PPR scoring format is an incredible play on top of the running potential he has in his given matchups. Now, continuing on, I don't want to be here all day at the running back position, but we have Cordero Patterson. Cordero Patterson, we know that this offense for Atlanta, no matter who they're playing against, they're going to run the ball 30 times a week. So really, you don't have to worry about him getting his opportunity. It is certainly going to be there. We have Saquon Barkley at the back end of this conversation on the very bottom. They take on Washington this week. That'll give you a clear indication as to what we can expect in week 15. And if in fact it is something that we want to avoid, and perhaps a trade could be in line. But yes, I do want to take advantage of week 16 and 17's matchups. But if week 15 is going to be that, win to stay in playoff kind of conversation, Saquon Barkley may not be able to get us there if his offensive line is battered and not healthy at that point. And then we talk about Austin Eckler. One of the last players I wanted to mention has the second toughest strength of schedule at the running back position. And yes, you have to remember, like I was mentioning, the fantasy points per game allowed by defenses is isolated to rushing statistics alone. So Austin Eckler, who is currently leading the running back position in terms of total receptions, targets, etc., is going to continue to thrive regardless of whether or not he has tough matchups on the ground. He's going to get himself, just like last week, 15 targets, 11 receptions. And even when Mike Williams comes back, he's still going to get that kind of utilization because Joe Lombardi has pretty much brainwashed Justin Herbert to be the next Drew Brees in that idea of just dumping it off and settling with a running back that can easily catch the ball out of the backfield, 4 yards behind, Justin Herbert and still get an additional 12 on top of it. But either way, when we're talking about the potential of Austin Eckler, it doesn't really bother me. And quite frankly, yes, even for those of you who are with Josh Jacobs for the remainder of the season and you don't have a trade to potentially be made, you got to understand that he is still going to be able to put up points on the ground through the air. We're just trying to look for the most overall potential for upside within given players based on matchups. Because outside of matchups, there are other variables. There are opportunities. There's health. There's the entire conversation of skill at the running back position and whether your running back can make defenders miss and whether or not he himself can get the job done, which we've seen Josh Jacobs do for majority of this season. Either way, we've talked about the running back position ad nauseum. I want to continue on and let's begin talking about the wide receiver conversation here. Let's talk about a couple wide receivers that we specifically like and a couple that we have to keep an eye on. Of course, the best matchup at the position going forward in terms of receiving statistics isolated or the Chicago Bears wide receivers. We know that Justin Fields is healthy. He did practice today at a full capacity, which is good. But Darnell Mooney, injured reserve surgery, he's done. The next man up within that offense is probably Chase Claypool, but I'm not sure if I want to trust him in any sort of capacity. But obviously the upcoming matchups for his schedule, Philadelphia, Buffalo, and Detroit, can be relatively advantageous. But a couple of the other players that I have more inclined hope for is, first and foremost, DJ Moore. The second best schedule going into the fantasy playoffs are the Carolina Panthers. And with Sam Darnold, throughout DJ Moore's career, in the 12 games that they have played together, whether that was in 2021 or even this season, DJ Moore is averaging 12.48 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring from with Sam Darnold under center. That makes me a lot more excited about the potential of what I expect to see from DJ Moore for the remainder of the season. Now, another player that I do like, of course, is New York Jets wide receiver rookie Garrett Wilson. In the 4 games that he has played without Zach Wilson under center specifically, whether that's been with Mike White or Joe Flacco, he's averaging 16.53 fantasy points per game, 4 touchdowns in 4 games. Garrett Wilson, another one of these options that could be an absolute smash play for the fantasy playoffs. And quite frankly, I expect to be bringing home a lot of championships for many of us now that that quarterback switch has been made. Now, I would have loved to have said that Cortland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy would be automatic, incredible plays for the fantasy playoffs, but quite frankly, the efforts of Russell Wilson really do hurt that potential. I think Matt Ryan does the same for his receivers in Indianapolis, which makes me want to continue to move on from them. Moving on, let's talk about the Green Bay Packers. Christian Watson, 6 touchdowns in the last 12 receptions. And I understand that's highly volatile, but regardless, they take on the LA Rams, which again, as a team are shutting down. They take on the Miami Dolphins, which as a secondary hasn't played well this season already. And the Minnesota Vikings, which is the best matchup at the wide receiver position over the course of the last 6 weeks. Incredible for Christian Watson. I mean, in week 1, he should have had himself a 70-yard receiving touchdown against Minnesota. Hopefully in week 17, when we get there, he ends up getting his revenge in scoring a touchdown against that defense, like the way he should have started his season. Now, another player that I like, besides a guy like DJ Moore, who is a little bit more of a veteran and has a quarterback that we're not so certain of, but could be of value to us, is Terry McLaurin for the Washington Commanders, taking on the New York Giants, San Francisco 49ers, Cleveland Browns. 3 good matchups in my mind, as long as the weather is going to be pristine to an extent to get him the ball. Because quite frankly, the fact that Terry McLaurin, since Taylor Heineke has taken the starting quarterback position, has garnered a 30% target share, has caught over 31% of the overall completions within this offense, leads me to believe that he is their primary number 1, and he's not slowing down anytime soon. And yes, he hasn't been able to score more than just 1 touchdown in the receiving game with Taylor Heineke, but I'm expecting those numbers to slowly but surely creep in the right direction. Obviously, they want to run the ball down in the red zone, but play action will eventually open itself up. Another player that I like as a rookie could potentially be George Pickens. I'm not even joking. George Pickens is an extremely talented wide receiver option, and if him and Kenny Pickett can get on the right page, and Kenny Pickett can continue to throw the ball in his direction at a high clip, I mean, we're talking about Carolina, Las Vegas, and Baltimore. That Carolina and Las Vegas matchups are extremely advantageous. We should see them put up great numbers there. George Pickens, as long as the momentum is there, could be a great option. We're moving on to talking about Tampa Bay. They're at the middle of this pack. Can we expect overall upside from these receivers? Absolutely. Are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers still pushing for a playoff run? Yes, absolutely. The whole question is, can Mike Evans get back on track? And I think he will. I mean, going up against Cincinnati, Arizona, then closing out with the Carolina Panthers seems like a pretty advantageous schedule, at least in the idea that you have to score against Cincinnati to even be relevant. You're going to have to throw for the entirety of that game. Not only that, going up against Arizona, they're relatively high-scoring offense themselves. So if the Tampa Bay defense isn't able to hold it together, we could end up seeing Godwin, of course, first and foremost, but Evans get back on track for the remainder of that season, specifically in the playoff push. A guy that, in my opinion, I'm buying low on for the fantasy playoffs. Another player that we wanted to mention before we move on to tight ends is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper has been a guy that earlier this season was named as potentially someone that could be a fantastic fantasy playoff league winner. His schedule, Baltimore, New Orleans, and Washington, isn't great. And if, in fact, the weather concerns for those 3 games are as bad as we potentially expect, it could be a trouble. Now, the whole question in my mind is whether or not Deshaun Watson is going to be the Deshaun Watson of old. Because if he is, we talked about it ad nauseum for the last, I would say, 3 months now, in regards to when Deshaun Watson has gone ahead and had a number 1 wide receiver, whether that has been DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, the last 38 games he played with DeAndre Hopkins, DeAndre was averaging 16.29 fantasy points per game. With Will Fuller, the last 31 games he played with him, Will Fuller was averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. Even with Brandon Cooks, weeks 15 through 17 of the 2020 season, Brandon Cooks was averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. The number 1 of the Deshaun Watson offense has always been valuable. So Amari Cooper, whether that is even just him, Donovan Peoples-Jones, David Bell, could all be of value going forward, despite the fact that their matchups aren't the greatest. Deshaun Watson could elevate them in that capacity. Now, the final player I wanted to mention is, of course, Christian Kirk. At the very bottom of this conversation, he is technically in a really difficult strength of schedule, considering they take on the New York Jets in that singular week. Whether it's Sauce Gardner, even before that, we even have the Trayvon Diggs matchup. But I don't think Sauce Gardner and Trayvon Diggs are traveling to cover him in the slot position. They're not going to shadow Christian Kirk. They're going to be covering Marvin Jones Jr. and or Zay Jones, which continues to give me the idea that Christian Kirk is going to be the go-to for the fantasy playoffs with such high potential touchdown upside down in the red zone. Absolutely someone that I want to have on roster for that stretch of time. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the tight end position. Here's the whole cold hard facts about the tight end position. The tight end position is so inconsistent and so reliant on touchdowns as a whole that really, if you have a stud tight end, keep them on roster. Do not even question it. Guys like TJ Hawkinson, yes, they're at the middle of the pack here, but TJ Hawkinson in the last 4 games, averaging 8.5 targets, 6.5 receptions, 48 receiving yards per game, 9.55 fantasy points per game, gotta keep him. Guys like Dalton Schultz, with Dak Prescott this season in the 6 games that they have played together, averaging 9.98 half PPR fantasy points per game, gotta keep him on roster. But other guys that we might want to potentially look at, Robert Tonyan, even though he has the best strength of schedule, minimal usage this season, only scored 1 touchdown, not really interested in it. Maybe Tyler Conklin could put something together with the quarterback switch, but it's not a guarantee in that overall regard. Jelani Woods obviously showed off on Monday night. 9 targets, 8 catches, 98 receiving yards, 14.3 fantasy points, a great week. But can he be consistent in his efforts, considering the matchups that we have going forward are such advantageous positions? Tyler Higbee in a pretty advantageous position, but you got to remember, Tyler Higbee this last week quite literally ran 0 routes. He pretty much established himself as an extra blocking tight end or offensive lineman in week 12, which going forward is probably going to be the case considering this offense is shutting down. But again, like I've mentioned, when we're talking about studs like a Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Hawkinson, Schultz, Goddard when he comes back from the injured reserve, these are guys that automatically play. They have no question in mind. Now, obviously, we want to hope that guys like Greg Dulcich, Tyler Conklin, can step up and can have incredible fantasy playoff pushes. Maybe even a guy like Darren Waller returning could be of value. But as of right now, again, you got to just continue to play your studs and maybe just play matchups for the fantasy football playoff push. Moving on, let's talk about the quarterback position. Quarterback position is pretty difficult to go ahead and potentially predict, but I want to mention 3 names that if in fact you can have on roster, even if you won't have Josh Allen or, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes on your roster, these 3 names could be of high value to you. First and foremost, Lamar Jackson takes on Cleveland, Atlanta, Pittsburgh in the fantasy playoffs. This is a team that is still trying to make the playoffs in their own right in the NFL. And of course, he's trying to secure a massive bag. Week 12 was the first time since week 3 that he's posted a top 10 quarterback performance in fantasy football. So it's been quite a while, but hopefully he's getting back on track here going forward. Tom Brady's another name. Again, they're going to continue to make a push for the playoffs. And as long as there are teams like Cincinnati, Arizona, and Carolina in their way, these are relatively friendly potential matchups for Tom Brady, who wants to throw the ball for the majority of the game. Hopefully his offensive line gets healthy. Hopefully we'll end up seeing, Ryan Jensen, the center back by then. Hopefully Tristan Wirfs will come back from that high ankle sprain by the time we get to week 15 and they're ready to go. The last player I wanted to mention is Justin Herbert. Even though for the entirety of the season he's been underwhelming, he will have Keenan Allen, Mike Williams back at that current position. And when they are back, Corey Linsley, their center, will be back. I expect this team to absolutely be lighting it up against Tennessee, Indianapolis, and of course the LA Rams, who have shut down. And by week 17, will have certainly shut down their entire offense and defense. I'm expecting a lot from those 3 quarterbacks. I would have loved to have said by at this point, Russell Wilson is going to be the best quarterback in the fantasy playoffs, considering the strength of schedule. But unfortunately, the fact of the matter is we can't trust that. Russell Wilson hasn't been good enough. Aaron Rodgers hasn't been consistent enough. I mean, Mike White has the 3rd best strength of schedule, assuming he keeps the position, against Detroit, Jacksonville, and Seattle. I mean, you never know. The kid could end up pulling it out. You never know. Especially in a team that wants to continue to try to win to get into the playoffs. If he can be consistent, we could find fantasy production there. You might want to keep him as your second quarterback going forward. Let's talk about kickers and defenses, special team players per se. Let's talk about team defenses for the remainder of the season. Weeks 15 through 17. I wanted to primarily focus on a couple things. First and foremost, thus far this season, over the course of the last 6 weeks, weeks 7 through 12 in fantasy football, the team that has given up the most points to opposing defenses in fantasy has been the Houston Texans. Over the course of the last 6 weeks, they have given up 10, 9, 8, 9, 19, and 18 fantasy points. Whether it's Davis Mills, Kyle Allen, they're the best matchup, giving up 12.17 fantasy points per week. So when I've gone ahead and calculated the potential schedule here, of course, it's not a surprise that the Kansas City Chiefs are at the top of this conversation because they take on Houston in week 15. Now, to give you some perspective, in my position, I've already gone ahead in a lot of my leagues that I've clinched the playoff spot in. I've gone ahead and picked up the Kansas City Chiefs as an additional roster spot because I want to play them in week 15, absolutely without a doubt in my mind. Now, another team that has given up their fair share of points in terms of fantasy points per week to opposing defenses. Now, obviously, Houston's been number 1. Indianapolis has been number 2. New Orleans number 3. Chicago number 4. That's a crazy number to see. That Chicago is still giving up their fair share of points. 5, 11, 9, 10, 12, and 8. Even with Justin Fields on the field, they've given up their fair share of points to opposing team defenses, which bodes the question if Justin Fields maybe isn't even healthy for the remainder of the year. I know he was, practicing today and he's good to go, but there may be a conversation that you might want to play your specific defenses up against Chicago. And the other teams that you might want to be playing up against is the Broncos and the Rams. And the reason why I primarily say that, besides the fact that, Houston has given up a lot of points to opposing defenses in terms of statistics, whether it's, the sacks, interceptions, return touchdowns, all of that. Specifically, when we talk about defenses in fantasy football, a lot of it has to do with points allowed. The Denver Broncos have scored the least amount of points as an offense over the course of the last 6 weeks, only scoring 66 points, 11 points per week, while the Rams, since week 7, have only scored 74 fantasy points. Those are teams that you want to absolutely play up against. So maybe playing the Green Bay Packers against a shutdown LA Rams team in week 15, fantastic. Besides playing Kansas City there against Houston. Another matchup could absolutely be, keeping Kansas City for week 17 against Denver. Or potentially getting yourself into a conversation where you're picking up the Tennessee Titans up against the Houston Texans, because we know Derrick Henry's going to run all over that defense. They're going to blow them out and play incredible football. The Denver Broncos going up against the LA Rams in week 16. Both those teams, defensive matchups where we could end up getting a extremely low scoring game. And if anybody scores, it's kickers in that matchup. Nonetheless, just wanted to isolate this, give you guys these statistics on screen so you can go ahead and approach for the upcoming potential schedule. I think the Kansas City Chiefs absolutely need to be on roster, specifically because of their week 15 and 17 games going ahead. Let's talk about kickers to close out today's episode. So here's the conversation that we have regarding kickers. I've gone ahead and done the math in terms of fantasy points allowed to kickers by opposing defenses. I'd like to objectively say that this is an extremely difficult statistic to potentially predict. I typically approach the kicker position based on consistency and or offense's likelihood to stall down in the red zone. That's why I like Jason Myers so much from the Seattle Seahawks. He's played incredibly well this season. We know guys like Nick Folk attached to offenses that can get down there but aren't always going to score. But it really depends on what the weather looks like. We obviously want to continue to play teams that are going to be in advantageous matchups and favorable ones. But as of thus far this season, based on the calculations that I've made in comparison to the fantasy points allowed in terms of a standard league where you get 5 points for a 50-yard field goal, 4 points for a 40-yard field goal, 3 points for a 30-yard field goal, and then 3 for anything less, 1 point per PAT, no points for any misses. This is the potential strength of schedule for the remainder of the season for potential kickers. So Chase McLaughlin for the Indianapolis Colts, Will Lutz for the New Orleans Saints, Mason Crosby for the Green Bay Packers. Guys that have not been consistent this year, but could be in that conversation going forward. I doubt it. Just play your studs. Play guys like, Graham Gano for the New York Giants, right there, number 4. Justin Tucker, number 5, for the Baltimore Ravens. Cameron Dicker for number 9 for the Los Angeles Chargers. A lot of potential there. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This was a long-winded episode, but of course, we got to go ahead and divulge this information because it is important to set yourself up for success for the fantasy playoffs in regards to all these players. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to comment down below. Of course, while you're down there, if you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Click the like button. Thank you very much. After tonight's Thursday night football game, I'll, of course, be live streaming here on the channel. So if you're interested in terms of talking about today's video, you can go ahead and swing on by, ask away. Outside of that, again, if you want to play more daily fantasy at your fingertips for tonight's game in specific, be sure to check out PrizePicks. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, my 3 picks, of course, less punts on the Buffalo punter. We had Josh Allen going more on his rushing yard total and Ramondre Stevenson going more on his reception total. Go ahead and check that out today. You use promo code Andrew, and when you sign up, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Check that out. And until tomorrow, guys, thank you, and I'll see you guys. Peace.